honor of introducing the host and master of ceremonies of today's program. Graduate of Creighton University Finance and International Businesses, current operational analyst at Matson, current Miss Hawaii US International, Miss Melody Higa.
Aloha, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the first series of Journey to Peace. My name is Melody Higa, and I am Miss Hawaii US International 2024. I am so honored to be your host today. I have been a part of Journey to Peace since the beginning, and I couldn't be prouder of everything that we have planned, organized, and put into action thus far. I joined the JPI team because I wish the idea of war was an extinct term that wasn't relevant to our current generation. We have seen the rise of tension across borders, and although we may think that it might not impact us, we'll see the trickling effects that somehow impact us one way or another. I studied abroad in South Korea in 2017, when North Korea started testing nuclear missiles, and my parents were in constant worry of my safety. It is something we need to learn and talk about in order to prevent it from happening in the future. I'm now going to hand it off to Sunny to share a little bit more about what Journey to Peace is and how you can become involved. So Sunny is an active duty airman at the U.S. Air Force, stationed at Joint Base Pearl Harbor, Guam. Prior to enlisting, he served as the Director of Communications for the State Ethics Commission in New Mexico and is the co-author of Outside the Margins, the Blue Book on the Global Refugee Crisis. Sunny now serves as an intelligence analyst in the 392nd Intelligence Squadron. Please give me a warm welcome to Sunny.
Thank you, Melody. So at its core, the Journey to Peace initiative is a world-class learning moment. The functional mechanism here is simple. There's three parts. The first is to create a platform for experts to unpack critical events throughout history. The second is to hold these critical discussions in historically significant places to ground the experience. And then the third is to engage cohorts of students, professionals, and emerging leaders to build both their understanding of history's most important lessons and also build a sense of accountability to one another. Here's why that's important. Because leadership is one of the most consequential variables throughout history. Because we can have a nation of the greatest thinkers, the most advanced scientists, and the most ambitious industries, but still become trapped in a spiral of competition and vilification against one another in our nations and throughout the world if there is no recognition of common humanity between us. The long-term goal for JPI is to provide a platform of rigorous development for future leaders who know each other's people, who will remember each other's children when hostilities render the sacrifice of human progress politically expedient. That's our objective here today, to foster a common humanity, to build communication bridges and provide the historically relevant lessons and case studies that will save us from repeating history's unfortunate, consistent pattern of escalating conflict. The first iteration will serve as our jumping off point to discuss the events, moments, people, and principles that will give us an in-depth understanding of the complexity of international relations, intricacies of peace, and the cost of miscommunication. We will continue future seminars for JPI with the same format, expert discourse on historical ground with those who will bear a heightened responsibility to advocate for peace. In the end, that's what JPI is about, observing our responsibility towards peace as much as we do towards competition. To prepare, advocate, and labor towards peace as the ultimate objective of a stable and prosperous humanity for future generations. Thank you all so much for being here, and we look forward to the discussion. Ellie?
Thank you, Sunny. Now I just want to do a quick voting poll. Who here is interested and really wanted to attend this? And who is here against their will? Nobody? Perfect. Well, I'm so excited to have this esteemed panel of judges and panelists here before you. I am no expert whatsoever, so I'll hand it off to the people that you came for. But as a disclaimer, please note that these opinions stated today are on the behalf of the individuals and not on the behalf of any organization. Now I would like to introduce to you Karen Knudsen. Karen has extensive experience in working in the Asia-Pacific region in public affairs, strategic outreach, and international conference and community event coordination. She's the co-president of the East-West Center Association Executive Committee and serves on Chaminade University's Board of Regents, the American Red Cross Pacific Island Region Board of Directors, and the Japan American Society of Hawaii Board of Directors. Please give a warm welcome to Karen Knudsen.
Thank you very much, Melody. Very nice. And thank you, Sunny, very much for your overview of the important initiative in recognizing all of us who had the vision of this project. This is a highly dedicated group who put this event together today, and it's so important in today's world. Just 2 days ago, on July 4th, I returned from a 2-week trip to the Philippines and Japan. In the Philippines, there are memories and references to World War II throughout the country. For those of you who have been to the Philippines, you know what I mean. The Battle of Corregidor, the Death March of Bataan, and many more. The Philippines now face new threats to its borders, its islands, and the South China Seas. And I want to mention also, John also has just arrived here after traveling from the East Coast, and so both of us might be a little bit jet lagged today, which is why I'm reading many of my remarks. Also a disclaimer, when I check my phone, I'm not checking texts or emails, I'm checking the time because I don't have a watch. So just be aware that I'm not. My time in Japan, of course, Japan bears the scars of its failed ambition amid the museums and memorials of those who perished in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Japan is now one of the United States' most important allies in the region. And it's interesting to see how we can go from enemies to now very close friends, and that's part of what we want to avoid, that middle section, and that's what this initiative is about. Given the current tensions and challenges facing the Indo-Pacific region, today's launch of the Journey to Peace initiative couldn't come at a better time. Today's program will begin with a historical overview, and followed by a series of factual as well as rhetorical questions for the panelists, and of course, Q&A from the audience. Participants should have received, or they will receive, a card, 3x5 card, if you'd like to write your questions down, and they'll be picked up by someone in the audience checking for them, or we'll have roving microphones for you to ask your questions. So now, joining us today for this very important panel are distinguished guests and experts in their field, and I'm highly honored to introduce all of them. I'll give them an introduction, each of them, and then we'll turn it over and start the program. First, I'd like to start on my far left and introduce John C. McManus. He's an award-winning professor, author, and military historian. You're going to receive your leg. Professor McManus holds the position of Curator's Distinguished Professor of U.S. Military History at the Missouri University of Science and Technology, and is one of the nation's leading military historians. He has written 15 well-received books, including the trilogy, Fire and Fortitude, the U.S. Army in the Pacific War, 1941 to 1943, Islands Infernos, the U.S. Army's Pacific War Odyssey, 1944, and To the End of the Earth, the U.S. Army and the Downfall of Japan, 1945. In addition to writing his books, speaking to the media and accepting speaking engagements around the country, like he's doing today, he also carries a full teaching load at Missouri SNT. Just a little bit of his background. He started out with a bachelor's degree in sports reporting at the University of Missouri School of Journalism, but his love of history took him in a different direction, so he gave that up, and I think it was a good choice for us. Next, I'd like to introduce General David Bramlett. He's a retired United States Army 4-star general who commanded the U.S. Army Forces Pacific Command from 1996 to 1998, following his service as Deputy Commander-in-Chief and Chief of Staff of the U.S. Pacific Command. Sir, your lane. Fortuitously, General Bramlett's first assignment upon graduation from the U.S. Military Academy was as a platoon leader in Hawaii. He's a Vietnam veteran, having served 2 tours in Vietnam from 1965 to 1966 and again from 1968 to 1969. During his long and distinguished career, General Bramlett served as Deputy Director, Plans, Policy, and Program Directorate at U.S. Central Command and held leadership positions at bases across the country, including Fort Campbell, Kentucky, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, MacDill Air Force Base in Florida, at West Point in New York, and as Commanding General at Fort Wainwright, Alaska. I personally know General Bramlett from his community service in Hawaii with the Hawaii Army Museum Society, as a board member of the Pacific and Asian Affairs Council, and as a member of Chaminade University Board of Regents. Also, his lovely wife, Nora, who's a dentist and has done work in the Marshall Islands. Pro bono. Thank you very much. And third, Ambassador Jim Moriarty, who has served as a U.S. Ambassador to Bangladesh from 2008 to 2011 and to Nepal from 2004 to 2007. Prior to that, he was Special Assistant to the United States President and Senior Director for Asia at the National Security Council from 2002 to 2004. In his role at the NSC, he advised the President and coordinated U.S. policy on East Asia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and South Asia. Previously, he had served as Director for China Affairs at the National Security Council in 2001, and as head of the political sections at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing from 1998 to 2001, and at the American Institute in Taiwan from 1995 to 1998. He's very fluent in Mandarin. Upon retirement after 36 years with the U.S. State Department, Ambassador Moriarty has worked with the Bauer Group Asia, a leading U.S. business consultancy, and as chief of party to set up a U.S. government project to build capacity in ASEAN's Association for Southeast Asian Nations, political, security, and social cultural communities. In 2016, he was tapped to serve as AIT chair and served in that capacity until 2023. And sir, when you didn't, I forgot, delay. Yeah, I was going to say, Jim, you might also want to let people know what AIT is, because they might not know. It's an acronym that some Americans might not be used to. But I want to say also as a personal note, Ambassador Moriarty and his wife, Ambassador Lauren Moriarty, were the East-West Center's first and only tandem diplomats in residence in the early 1990s. I know the Moriartys fairly well. Don't tell Lauren I said that. Okay. I would like to begin. Now we have someone who's seen action up close with General Bramlett. We've had the diplomatic side who's worked to try to deflect conflict, and we have the historian. And we're going to lead with the historian to take a deeper dive into the end of World War II, or what's led up to this. There'll be some maps if you'd like to use them, John.
Yeah, great. Crystal, if we could go maybe to the first map. There we go. Okay, so what I'd like to do, as I understand it, we're eventually getting to the discussion of Saipan. I want to kind of set that up for you and set up, something where the conflict comes from. That's a big topic. So I'm distilling a bit, and obviously in the Q&A we can focus on what particularly interests you. But I would say in a kind of broad generalization, I admit this is a little bit like asking Mrs. Lincoln how she enjoyed the play, but U.S.-Japanese relations tended to be pretty good throughout most of their joint modern history. And yet you have this sort of colossal kind of, nosedive in the 1930s, but tension is already existing, dating back to World War I. Where a lot of this is coming from is the fact that Japan believes that it is in a kind of an existential kind of, how will I put it, that they are in an existential struggle for the kind of resources they're going to need in order to compete with the Western powers, especially oil. And as Japan is thinking of itself as a major imperial player along much of our map here, particularly in East Asia, as you get further into the South Pacific and the Middle Pacific, like Saipan, whatever else, the Japanese are really thinking that if they don't get access to their own resources and access to the Asian continent, that they are not going to be able to be an independent sovereign nation anymore. That they will be waylaid in the same way China had. You know, you probably all heard of the open door in China, how basically the mostly Western imperial powers had come to China and carved out their own economic spheres of influence, not really as colonies, but certainly dominating China on some levels. And so, you know, this remains very, very firm in their memory too, obviously. And the Japanese had seen this and didn't want it and really thought, we need to get ahead of this problem. At the same time, of course, too, the Americans have their own imperial holdings in the Pacific, of which they're sort of ambivalent. In the Philippines, of course, they've got Guam, but also they're part of the open door in China. And so the Americans are invested in the status quo in China circa 1920s and the 1930s, meaning the continuation of a balance of power on the Asian continent and perhaps elsewhere in the Pacific. And this has been sort of enforced through the Washington Naval Agreement of the early 1920s, which had basically consigned second-class status to the Japanese in terms of naval hardware in exchange for the Japanese being able to fortify many of their holdings, island holdings in the Pacific. Okay, so you're seeing the sort of foundation for some level of tension, but this didn't necessarily have to lead the war. It really didn't. So what takes hold in the meantime in Japan, and especially is exacerbated as you have the world economic crisis in the early 1930s, is this kind of nihilism of the Japanese saying to themselves, you know, we need to be the leading power in Asia and the Pacific, and that's what it's going to take to have the resource and self-sufficiency and sovereignty. Otherwise, we will be knuckled under to the Western powers, as many other Asians had. And so a lot of this is cloaked in militarism and sort of hyper-patriotism. So you have this really sort of tragic and interesting dynamic in Japanese life, especially in the 1930s, in which there's a lot of moderate voices that don't want conflict with the United States. They are determined to avoid it. Of course, most of their solid military thinkers understand that this will probably not redound to Japan's advantage. But they are, and this is really the cautionary tale of this to some extent, it shows you that extremist voices and mindsets can really dominate the policy space, much more so than moderates can. And in the Japanese armed forces, when you have moderates ascending to positions of power or to the prime ministership or whatever, they tend to be attacked by these kind of hyper-patriotic forces that really are advocating a more confrontational kind of expansionist course of action. In the meantime, the Americans, the British, and the Western powers are invested in this idea of the status quo, so you can kind of see where this leads. So there's a really interesting sort of anecdotal approach to this. In the 1930s, we had, I think, a remarkable ambassador in Japan, Ambassador Joseph Drew, who was there throughout much of the decade and all the way through the attack on Pearl Harbor and elsewhere. Drew knew so many Japanese so well, had very good productive relationships. He is desperately trying to avoid war, and so many other Japanese are too. But they're getting swept up in these forces that are there in Japanese society that are sort of cloaked in anti-Western imperialism, but it's become this kind of Japanese imperialism too. Ironically, because you'd already seen this happen in China, and of course once the Japanese war in China begins in the 1930s, this amps up tension with the United States on a massive level because we're invested in this balance of power. So at the same time, the United States is having to kind of react to this, not wanting a conflict, but not wanting to retreat from that idea of the status quo and the balance of power. So you have on your hands a very difficult situation. Added to this mix is the lack of American military preparation for the war, which is certainly an element to this equation as well. And you have the makings of something very tragic. So what is really a kind of a cautionary tale, and I've come to believe from studying this war, that unlike the war in Europe, it didn't necessarily have to be fought. I mean, the war in Europe, you're dealing with an aggressive maniac, for lack of a better way to put it, in Adolf Hitler, who was determined on an expansionist course and will do nothing else, and you must react to that. The Japanese aren't quite that way, and Hirohito certainly doesn't fit that category. And their decision-making and their leadership structure is much more complex than you have in Germany at that point. So you see back and forth, Gru trying to diffuse tension. His colleagues in the Japanese Foreign Ministry and some of the Japanese armed forces and other positions of government or whatever, trying to do their best too, is very, very well-meaning folks coexisting with this kind of push towards war. And so when it comes, of course, it comes not just with the dramatic attack here at Pearl Harbor. I think it's important to remember that the Japanese attack at the end of 1941 is part of what they call the centrifugal offensive, which is the expansion of operations in China. And really what they want on our map here is what is today Indonesia. And that was what was called the Dutch East Indies back then. And why are the Dutch there? Resources, especially oil. Oil, tin, bauxite, rubber, but especially oil. The Americans had tried to negotiate with the Japanese through sanctions, saying if you don't behave, then we are going to withhold oil, we are going to withhold scrap iron, steel. The Roosevelt administration tries all of this to no avail. But I'd also point out too, and here's something that I think is worth noting. Pearl Harbor is just the most dramatic attack on the U.S. that the Japanese unleashed. In the late 30s and the early 40s, there were many attacks on American interests in China. American missionaries who were there, so missions that were there, American-owned property and businesses and whatever else. So you had this amping of tension for a long period of time. And the Americans saying this has to stop, the Japanese saying we cannot or will not stop it, and so then you have this terrible conflict. So that when the war begins, and I don't want to go on too long here, but I wanted to set up where we are by 1944. When the war begins, the Japanese have decided to basically pursue a two-front war. We think of that in terms of Germany in Europe, of course, attacking the Soviet Union famously and disastrously, right? Well, the Japanese would like to do the same thing. The Imperial Japanese Army had its war on the Asian continent in China, and it was raging on and had not ended by the end of 1941. And now, especially the Imperial Japanese Navy, has its war in the Pacific against the Western powers, and obviously this is too much for Japan to deal with. They conquer a major expanse of our map here, of course, which was more than they expected. From an Army perspective, to them, this is the Navy's war out here. And the Army isn't really getting that serious about the war with the Americans until pretty well into 1943 and early 1944 on some levels, at least, because they're having to. They have to at that point. So by the time of mid-1944, of course, the Americans have completely turned the tables on them, and our inherent strengths economically and manpower-wise, industrially, have all begun to kick in with an incredible Navy that is now going to come into play here, but also the importance of our ground power here, too. Well, this is something that makes you, I think, step back and sort of think of a different perspective here. As this war unfolds and when it breaks out, there are many Japanese servicemen who are very convinced that they are fighting a war of liberation. Because to them, much of Asia and the Pacific region have been waylaid by white imperialists. And now this was their time to step up and end that. And that's what the war meant to them. They didn't necessarily know they're being manipulated by a government that really had its own imperial ambitions too, and that's partially what had caused the war, and partially the tragedy. There's so many of these young men being used, in that sense, for a war that they misunderstood and that many of them didn't want either. So by mid-1944, we've gone so far down this path that it's just become a demographic tragedy, a catastrophe for the Japanese already by that point. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, John. You mentioned so many things that I think reflect different other chapters in recent history too. So I'm going to see if Ambassador Moriarty or General Bramlett want to comment from their lens, their perspective on what you've just said. Jim, do you want to take this?
Can you hear me now? First of all, quick explanation. AIT is the American Institute in Taiwan. Officially, it's a nonprofit incorporated in Washington, D.C. But in Taiwan, it looks and acts basically like an embassy. It has the same sort of sections. Its funding comes almost entirely from the State Department, but with some from other agencies. And as the tensions with China increase, it's becoming a bigger and bigger spot, and with more and more attention, more and more visitors. And so that's what AIT is. Yes, my wife and I are not totally random, but we have been tandem for a long time. John, what a great introduction. You know, I do think I'm not a Japan expert at all. I know a lot about China. I've done a little bit and worked with the Japanese a bit, but the tensions inside the system in Japan that you began to lay out, I think, are absolutely unforgettable. And you know, I do think, as I look at China, that's one of the big problems, is that you don't have the sort of differing voices kind of arguing for one path forward or another. And you used to have that. Okay, my time in China was dealing with what you would call a collective leadership. You had a body called the Standing Committee, 7 to 9 members, and any major decision, you had to get the consensus of that Standing Committee. For example, after the Tinian massacre, Chinese economy was tumbling. The party had lost legitimacy in the eyes of the people. A powerful group within that Standing Committee, led by the Premier, Li Peng, argued that because of the mistakes that came from opening up to the West, China should retreat back to a planned economy. Deng Xiaoping, who many of you have heard of, for a year and a half had to convince the other members of the Standing Committee that, look, you know, if we don't develop the economy, make this country more prosperous, then we will never be able to continue the rule of the party. That basically we will lose the confidence of the people and it won't work. It took them a year and a half to do that. Nowadays, there's only one man in charge in China, so it's a very different system. And in a way, I've been looking at the history of what was going on in Japan, and it's so contrary to what you have right now in China, where people have to agree with whatever they think the leader wants. I'm not sure there's a question there, but do you have any comments on it?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Yeah, General Bramlett.
Thanks, Jim. Let me go back to the military lack of preparation, unpreparedness in 1940-41 that John talked about. Look at our society today. Look at the people. Look at the divisions in our country on the view of the Gaza campaign, Ukraine. Now, World War II, there was none of that. There might have been fringe objections prior. Remember, the vote for selective service in 1940 only passes by one vote. That's it. And of course, with the draft, the National Guard divisions began to be plussed up. Looking at the people, because the passion of the people come into play for World War II. And it's hard for us to remember that. I'm of the generation where my dad spent 3 years in the Pacific with Air Group 9. My uncle loaded aerial mines in Okinawa. The other uncle landed the first wave at Tarawa, is a Navy medic. He never recovered from that experience. So I grew up listening to stories of World War II. I read my mother's poetry that was angry at Japan. There was no mention or poetry of Germany. It was always Japan because of the dastardly attack. Now, they didn't, the public didn't have the benefit of John McManus's run-up and all of the difficulties in Asia. And I'm not sure the American public realized until Pearl Harbor. Let me go take you back. I've been able to get the Gallup report polls from that era. You might be interested, given this polling that goes on now in our country, but actually the Gallup did that back. And I will read you from the poll of November 25th, 1941. They asked the people they contacted, in your opinion, what is the most important problem the United States government must solve in the next few months? Number one was preventing strikes in defense production related to the military. Then number two, what to do about Japan. That was number two. The same survey said, should the United States take steps now to keep Japan from becoming more powerful, even if this means risking a war with Japan? And again, John's great run-up should give you the context for that. The American public at the time said yes by 74%. Do you think the United States will go to war against Japan sometime in the near future? It's 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor. Yes, 53%. If the United States goes to war against Japan, do you think it will be a long war or a short one? 60% say a short war. Do you think a war between our country and Japan would be difficult for one of us or comparatively easy one? Easy, say 50% of the Americans. Only 34% said it was going to be difficult. January of 1944, 6 months later, the Battle of Saipan will take place. We'll talk about that later. The question is, do you personally hate the Japanese people? No, 70%. Now, at the end of the war, September of 1945, the war is over. Listen to these two questions. Would you be willing to continue to put up with present shortages of butter, sugar, meat, and other ration food products in order to give food to people who need it in Europe? Yes, 74%. Same question. Would you be willing to continue to put up with present shortages of butter, sugar, meat, and other ration food products in order to give food to people who need it in Japan? No, 63%. This is after the atom bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is also after the bloody battles of Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the Philippines. The American people will lose 110,000 killed in action, died of wounds. Those casualty figures, 42,000 in the Army, 31,000 in the Navy, 23,000 in the Marine Corps, and 15,000 Army Air Corps. Those are a lot of stars in people's windows. And the passion of the American people was such that over time, even after the war was won, the sentiment was, let the Japanese suffer. And I say that as a cautionary note. The passion of the people, that is up to the government, and we'll talk about some of the theories of war, and the government, the diplomats, to be able to harness that passion. Now, you all know the outcome of World War II in Japan was General MacArthur and others. It was a much more enlightened approach. And several of the soldiers who lived in the communities there, the Military Intelligence Service, for example, and brought Japan, helped Japan recover. But I only mention that because of the impact of casualties, the impact of the passion of our nation to be able to do that. Now that passion translated into mobilization. We talked about the unprepared military. Let me just throw a couple of figures out. We all know what aircraft carriers look like, and there's one out there for RIMPAC. At the Battle of Midway, it was June 1942, we had 3 carriers. At Saipan, we'll have 15 carriers. At Midway, we'll have 29 ships. The commander at Saipan will have up to 600 ships. At Okinawa, less than a year later, there will be 40 carriers at Okinawa and 13 to 1,500 ships. And impassioned people will stop everything, mobilize equipment, personnel, and it's on one hand, it shows us what a unified country can do. It also is a cautionary tale about what the passion of people. And I only mention that to give you a context for that sense of the people's sentiment during the time frame we're talking.
Thank you each. Jim.
Could I just ask a question about, were you able to look at polls, say, from 2 years earlier, about the late 1930s, on a similar question?
I failed.
Okay.
No. There is one, which I think is more than about just the war against Japan. 1937 Gallup poll showed that 70% of the American people felt involvement in World War I had been a mistake. So if you felt that way in the late 1930s, and then now you have this new looming crisis, especially in relation to Europe, obviously where the Americans had gone into World War I, there was that kind of disillusionment and a determination to avoid it ever again. So you've got a pretty bitter argument going on in this country in the late 30s and 1940 and 41 on how involved we should be. And the Roosevelt administration is a little bit out of step in relation to that, and has to really proceed warily in relation to public opinion. The Lend-Lease Act, which is passed after Roosevelt is reelected for a third time, passed in March 1941, is really, in retrospect, the last step before U.S. involvement in the war in Europe. But what is happening concurrently, of course, in tandem with that, is these sort of sanction policies in relation to Japan, and it's all part of the same thing. So public opinion had migrated in that 4-year period, but there was very few who wanted to get involved in the war until obviously you have the dramatic attack on Pearl Harbor.
Thank you. So with all of that, the 20th century, the First World War, we thought we could never do that again. Second World War, never again. And yet then we had the Korean War, the Vietnam War. The 20th century was a bloody century, at least for the United States. Have we learned anything from that? Are we heading down the pathway? I mean, we can get into that and debate that, but have we learned anything from the last century?
Well, I wish I could
Well,
give
you're
you
the
a more
historian,
upbeat
but history
answer.
repeats itself and does it.
I mean, unfortunately, a lot of the bad parts sometimes do. I don't think, unfortunately, I've become a pessimist in this regard. I don't think we've learned enough from what was such an incredibly bloody century. In fact, the war in Asia on some levels was just beginning in September 1945. There's 10 million people who are going to lose their lives in post-colonial wars that are going to happen over the next 10 plus years and after. And of course, our wars in Korea and Vietnam are to some extent a legacy of our involvement in the region during World War II. As I look at the 21st century, and you look around the globe and see the level of tension and fighting that's going on, and of course what had happened in late 20th century too. Not just the dramatic wars that we think about as Americans, like in Korea and Vietnam, but all the other brush fire conflicts around the globe that happened in that time. I think it's very hard to be upbeat, hence my passion for this. But maybe there's some way, we can take steps that we can learn from the past. It's always my hope as a military historian.
Thank you. And so, go ahead.
Since you're asking the biggest question, I'll have to give a very diplomatic answer, which is it's very complicated. I mean, you've got, 192 countries in the world. They're all different. They all have different histories. They all have different education systems. And they all have a different perspective on the world. I would point out that, when you have countries that have similar values and similar interests, it's really easy to get along. I mean, you fight over little things, how many codfish can you catch in my waters and stuff like that. But ultimately, you have voters who will hold you to the interest of what you, as they see them. And so you can understand how democracies will react. And wars between democracies are very, very rare. I can't come up with good ones offhand, but I'm sure if I think long enough, we can come up with one depending on how you define democracy. The real variable is when democracies try to understand non-democratic systems, because then you don't get the voters as a check on the power of the state. The leaders of the state are by and large in charge of where that state goes. And so you got to understand what drives them, what they're thinking about. And frankly, you've got to be ready for the fact that at times you will come up with leaders who see their interest almost diametrically opposed to the interests of the U.S., to the interest of the other democracies of the world. And when those countries are particularly big and powerful, then history argues that you better buckle up and try to figure out what you can do to convince them to turn down a different road, or else war does begin to look more rather than less likely. I would say that we've probably seen that from President Putin for a long time now, and I worry that we might be seeing something similar from Chairman Xi. Please.
I think that's the lesson we took from World War I and World War II is what the ambassador just talked about. We learned to be very careful. When you tread on vital interests, and to do the best you can, as a military figure, certainly defer to the diplomats to determine. So sometimes the military can contribute to that analysis. But be very, very careful. A misstep, a miscalculation, and John talked about the run-up again, with Japan being starved by the materials it needed for its self-interest. And I think we're much more sensitive, at least my assessment is we're sensitive, much more sensitive to that than perhaps our predecessors in the wake of World War I and the immediate aftermath of World War II. So it's to be very, very sensitive. On the fringes, when we operate with non-like-minded entities or countries. A quick anecdote, when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, there was a warming of relations with the Soviet Union, now Russia, and the Russian generals came over to West Point to learn how do we do this. We're democracy, they're communist autocracy, if you will. And they came in, and I was stationed at West Point. I was the commandant, and so I took them around. And there was 4 or 5 of them. Russia has a lot of military schools, and they walked around, and they were impressed by our curriculum, our faculty, and so on. But we stopped as they were getting ready to leave, and we were looking at cadets being disciplined, and they were walking back and forth. Instead of the free time, they were naughty cadets. And so I was a disciplinarian. So they walked back and forth and back and forth. And the Russian generals were fascinated by this. And they said, what is this? Through an interpreter, I explained to them they were naughty, there's punishment. And they watched, it's mindless, trust me, to walk back and forth and think about your sins. After all, remember, it was punitive and it was deterrent. Rehabilitative value, not so much. But in any case, the Russian general, who would seem to be first among equals, he looked at me and he said, why do they obey you in a democracy? And I never thought about that because I took it for granted. And I explained to them that they volunteer, they serve their country, they obey orders of officers excuse me, appointed over them. It was a revelation for them. They thought democracy meant you could do whatever you want. And they asked, why did the cadets walk away? This is unpleasant. And then I realized that we have the ability, this country was our democracy, our principles, our loyalty to the Constitution of our country. Joseph Nye later coined the term smart power. In other words, we have an allure to non-democratic nations of an alternative way to do it. The American military does a lot of that over the last 40, 50 years, certainly in my lifetime. We done so much of the more of that to expose other different walks of life and different value systems in other countries to just be exposed to us. And hopefully that has an impact over time. My table mate is a young major, 10 years into my career, was an Indonesian major. He later became the Chief of Staff of the Indonesian Army. And I'm hopeful that he treated his subordinates, his army, as he saw the American Army. I can only hope. Just a long-winded answer for the subject.
Thank you very much. Each of you with your different perspectives. And especially, General Brum, thank you for pulling up that Gallup poll. That was really interesting and helps reflect what the United States was like back then. So I have a question that, and I'm going to put each of you in it, but one is, from your experience, can you provide an example of, or two of what, in your case, General, what the military does to help the journey to peace? And then, Ambassador, what the State Department, the diplomacy does, and even John, with your book writing as a teacher, what do you do? So General Bramlett, what does the military do to help our journey to peace?
Well, one of the things that the military does, as I touched on it, but on a larger scale, I want to say 40, 50, 60 years ago, I'm that old. I did not serve in World War II. Just to make clear. We began a systematic approach to train and work with other armies, and it's reached an art form. Some of the uniformed military here in the audience, and they know far better than I how many deployments they did to share with people. Interoperability is the term of art, but yet to get to know each other. We didn't always do that. We exchange officers. The officers serve on each other's staffs. This does two things. One, in an emergency, we can better cooperate and work together. And also, it sends a message to folks that don't wish us well that we have this capability to do things. RIMPAC's going on right now. You saw the ships, and I figure it's 27, 28 nations. The Navy does that, the Army does that, the Air Force does that in great extension. There are also personal exchanges. I mentioned my table mate at Leavenworth. I mentioned the opportunity with Russian generals. And forgive me for one more Russian general story. The Chief of Staff of the Russian Army, during this period before Putin, he came to Alaska to meet the Army general, Chief of Staff of the Army. And he brought his entourage, and they drink a lot of vodka and they have big hats. But they are really, where you strip away the ethnic differences, they're soldiers. And we showed them our soldiers in Alaska. And the thing that the Chief of Staff of the Russian Army wanted to talk to me at great length was, how do you keep your soldiers warm? Because his successor was facing me across the Arctic Circle. We were going to, the battle would be joined. I would be facing with the American Arctic Force to Russia. And that exposure, that humanity of how do you keep your soldiers warm, made a lot of impact on me, and I think Semyonov. I could multiply that 1,000 times in Germany, working with the other Eastern European countries as they get to know Americans, American military through the aviation, through the ground forces and so on. I think that's the best I can do, but now it comes under the rubric of engagement, and you can discern what the meaning of that word is. We've really made it a trademark of the American military.
Ambassador, before you answer, I just want to give a heads up. We're going to be asking for audience questions after this round. So if you haven't written your question, you can write your question, raise your hand. So, okay, Ambassador.
Thank you for giving me a question I might be able to answer. Diplomacy is basically, for an American diplomat, American diplomacy in general. It's advancing and protecting U.S. interests. Those change a little bit over time, but not that much. And of course, that always means when you're in an embassy overseas, making sure that American citizens are properly treated in that country. It also means that American businessmen should have a level playing field. But if you step back and go bigger than that, it's also trying to figure out where the country you're in is going. What does that mean for U.S. interests? Where's the overlap? What interests do you have that are the same as that country's interests? How do you work together to advance those? Importantly, and in times of stress like we have to admit we are in now, it's trying to identify where our interests are not in alignment and how that's going to affect the U.S. It's trying to tell Washington what's going wrong. Maybe there are certain ways that those issues can be corrected, and if not, maybe there are other countries that you can work with who share our interests. I know this is sounding pretty hypothetical, but when you're in a place where there's a lot going on, if a country during the war on terrorism, if a country gets hit by Islamic terrorists who are related to the ones who've hit the U.S., you have to figure out a way to work with that country effectively. Nowadays, things are changing quickly in Asia, but the encouraging thing is our diplomacy, our diplomats in the field are working closely with countries that share the same interests, and frankly also countries that share our values. And our values, Americans are always embarrassed about talking about that to some degree. And I always say, just look at our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence. Those are the ideals. We don't always meet them. For centuries we've fallen short, but those are the ideals. And there are a lot of countries who respect those ideals. There are a lot of people around the world who come to America specifically for those ideals. And I haven't done it myself, but I've talked to people who have been to the swearing-ins of new citizens, and they say it's an incredibly moving experience. People have traveled from around the world to come to America, maybe for job opportunities, but really because, okay, this is a place where if I work hard and I obey the laws, I can advance myself through my own efforts and people will treat me with respect. Quickly, you might not be able to guess this, but even though I've lived here a long time, I'm not native Hawaiian by birth. My wife does have some Hawaiian in her, and she recently gave me the best definition of aloha that I can remember, and that is to treat people with kindness and respect. And if we all have that for our default, then everything else becomes clearer. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, I think, the essence of what historians do is to chronicle the human experience. I mean, all the ups and downs, the pitfalls, the lessons that can be learned or not, whatever it would be. The things that are opaque that you'll never know because there isn't the source material or whatever it is that you're sort of passing through. I think by its very nature, history is an applied art, especially the closer we get to our own time period, in studying modern history. That to some extent is the point. So I think in the case of military historians, we even more so are looking at what are often the greatest disasters in human history and figuring out what went wrong, and not always the cause and effect of war, but the ins and outs of how the war was fought and the decisions that were made and how it affected people and the reverberations that are felt later on or whatever it is. And that's part of what has attracted me to World War II, because I see it as really the seminal event in human history, I think, but perhaps just modern history. And we're still feeling reverberations from it today, and here we all are. So I think it's terrifically consequential. And my concern is that there isn't enough priority to study of history and to study of military history and to learn from it in a tangible sense the best you possibly can. And I think you also, if you're going to study history well, you must begin and end with one word: empathy. Because that's how you really begin to develop an understanding, certainly of your historical subjects, but I think of your everyday contemporaries too, very similar to what the ambassador just said in the concept of aloha. I think a lot of that is empathy too, and we all want to be treated that way. Maybe history can teach us that.
General Bramlett, before we go on.
Well, this one thing, the Army got John McManus's word because about 50 years ago, they really emphasized military history in the curriculum. What can we learn about history? And it goes all the way from your young officer career all the way through the senior levels of the Army. They stress history, history, history. One footnote, when the ambassador was talking, we're sitting separately here, but the State Department and the Department of Defense work very closely together at the working level. The senior level headquarters always have a State Department representative, a very senior State Department, a career Foreign Service officer in the headquarters to remind the military mind of other dimensions of thought and analysis. And by the same token, whenever units deploy, when they go into a country, the #1 commander in the country is the ambassador. And we subordinate ourselves to the ambassador as a representative of the country. And so even though we talk differently in the microphone, please, if you go away with nothing else, recognize this integration that has really come a long way over the last 50 years or so of the cooperation between the State Department and the Department of Defense at the working operational level.
Thank you. Really good points all around. Thank you, all of you. Do we have any questions from the audience with a microphone? Okay, anybody? Be bold. Oh, thank you, ma'am.
I'm Rosemary Hedge, and I'm actually a New Zealander. And I'd just like to make a comment about the World War II and your comments, because my dad was an intelligence officer with the Fijian forces, and they were sent to the Solomon Islands and worked with the American forces under, I think it was General Griswold, and my dad's got a certificate for that. But he never spoke about the war until I found his intelligence notebook of all the sorties they did in the Solomon Islands, hunting out the Japanese and then working with the Americans. So this has been most interesting for me because we're remote down in New Zealand. But my question is, how do you view 2024 with all these elections that are going on around the world in democracies and not so democratic countries, and how do you think that's going to affect peace going forward?
Thank you, ma'am. Kia ora. I think this year there are more elections going on at every level than any other year in history, actually. I'm going to direct that to maybe Jim. Is there any one of you? Which one of you would like?
Of course, the ambassador.
Yeah, ambassador got to take it. Sorry, Jim.
There we go.
I could take the easy way out and quote Zhou Enlai when asked about his impressions about the French Revolution 150 years earlier, and he just said it's too early to tell. I will say that the elections lead to greater uncertainty among partners, among allies. I will also say, however, that it doesn't change the national interests, and in most cases it doesn't change the national values. So I've been involved in 3 transitions of U.S. governments. I'm totally non-political. I've been a career person. I've served Democrats. I've served Republicans. And I'll tell you, I voted for both ways, too. usually foreign policy doesn't change with a change of administrations too much, because the new administration brings in intelligent people who usually have some familiarity with the topics. And those intelligent people look at the same problems that the intelligent people from the other party were looking at beforehand. And they frequently come to similar conclusions about what the best path forward is. Sometimes they'll change the names of policies, but basically, they end up fine-tuning. And it's the great big global events that cause rapid change in policy. And those, we've talked about them. We've talked about December 7th, 1941. I think Americans will all remember September 11th. Those big events all of a sudden change policy dramatically. There is another way in which policy changes, and that is by the undeniable accumulation of facts. We and the Soviet Union together probably share the greatest credit for defeating Hitler in World War II. And after World War II, we wanted to pretend that we were going to continue to be friends and allies and partners and sharing similar concerns. By 1949, as the Soviet Union continued to try to undermine democracy throughout Central and Western Europe, it was clear that things had changed. And President Truman had the courage to get up and tell the nation that the Iron Curtain has descended across much of Europe. Unfortunately, I fear that we have come similar to that with, unfortunately / perhaps fortunately, we've come to a similar point with respect to China. I was one of the many China experts who believed that we would see economic reform and opening up inevitably leading to political reform, greater liberalization, a China that would be easier to work with. Instead, the economic reform got twisted into an attempt by China to use trade as a tool, not as an economic tool, but something called a power tool to enhance its leverage over other countries. And then we saw things like what's happened in Hong Kong, the continuing threats against Taiwan, and I think something that we don't concentrate on enough was Xi Jinping walking around the Rose Garden promising that China would never militarize the South China Sea. And within a few months, China was busy building what are now clearly military bases throughout the South China Sea, and is pushing around the Filipinos, trying to make sure that despite the International Tribunal saying these were Filipino waters, China says that they're theirs, and we'll use force to protect them. I raise that because I think there's been a real shift with respect to Asia, recognition that Asia is important, and that both parties recognize that. So I actually see continuity with respect to Asia. I'm less certain about other parts of the world with respect to U.S. policy. With respect to the Europeans, will the elections affect them? It might affect China policy or Asia policy for some of them, but I'll go back to Joe and Lai and say it's too soon to tell.
Thank you. The next question, John, I'll give to you, and maybe we touched on this a little bit. Do you see parallels between the 1930s and now?
Wow. Too soon to tell, just kidding. Yes, I do. I guess I'll confine my answer to the looming conflict with Japan that was in play in the 1930s versus tension with China now. It's very similar in the sense of a kind of sphere of interests, conflict, a sort of perception among at least what we think of as an aggressor nation, that this is a vital existential kind of threat, and that justifies the expansion, or at least the tensions. As you're saying, Ambassador, using your tools of leverage over other countries. all of this kind of stuff is very similar to Japanese encroachments on the Asian landmass that are happening in the 1930s. What I don't see, and I just don't claim to have anywhere near the expertise that you would have and so many others, but I don't perceive it this way, is the kind of agenda constantly being set by a fanatical coterie of super patriots, as you saw in the Japanese armed forces in the 1930s, who would, and did in many cases, when moderates would be in position to make decisions, would attempt to assassinate them, or would, or a prime minister or whatever, and even to some extent threatening the emperor's life if the emperor didn't kind of knuckle under to what they wanted, and using the emperor as the symbol to twist it all around in that respect. I don't know that I see that level of illogic and fanaticism in play here, but I do see the same sort of spheres of influence, balance of power issues, and also the same battle areas. That's the other thing too. We're building and developing a major airfield at Peleliu, for instance. Many of you know, of course, we fought a terribly tragic battle there in World War II. The idea being to seize an airfield. The 1st Marine Division and the Army's 81st Infantry Division fought their guts out there. Here we are back at Peleliu developing the Marianas again for whatever purpose. And so on the sort of hardcore nuts and bolts military side, yes, and amphibious doctrine and all of these kinds of things that could come into play. What I hope that military folks take from it is the importance of jointness and the importance of ground power ultimately in the outcome of World War II and subsequent wars, honestly, tells us a lot about what could happen in the future too. Just it's only purely my perspective.
Go ahead, Ambassador.
I guess I'm going to take right of first reply here. I would say, yeah, the systems are totally different between 1930s Japan and China's today. And in a way, I consider China's system, political system today, at least as worrisome as what you had in Japan. Because today you really have 1.4 billion people living under a system where one man makes every important decision. That one man has been accumulating all the power of government and statecraft to himself. He is now surrounded by people, his closest advisors. They call it a standing committee, 9 people, 9 men, no women. He's been there long enough so that those people around him have advanced precisely because they are willing to tell the leader, Xi Jinping, what they think he wants to hear, not what he needs to know. And so you have one person who doesn't have checks on their power, and you're not sure what information he's getting. And you're not sure where his biases are. Actually, you are fairly sure. In a way, that's similar to what we described with Japan. The Western powers are trying to contain China's rise. The democratic powers are trying to contain China's rise. And frankly, from my perspective as chairman of the American Institute in Taiwan, that China's rejuvenation can never be achieved without unification with Taiwan. And whether that is peaceful unification, which I consider highly unlikely because the 24 million people in Taiwan do not want to be ruled by Xi Jinping, or by force of arms, that's okay. It just depends on whether the Taiwanese agree to what he would term peaceful unification. So I very much worry about their political system.
Thank you. I'm going to look to the audience out here. Yes, sir. Right over here. I think a microphone will be coming. Thank you.
Austin Hammer, 42 years. I'd like to know what level of damage has the U.S. incurred with our Pacific partners and allies because of the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the abandonment of the ally there. I mean, we've had that in Vietnam, we've had it in '56 with the Hungarians. It has repeated over, but currently, what is the damage that you assess that we have to deal with now because of that?
Thank you very much. Did you write that as a question as well?
I did.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. I thought I recognized that. Ambassador.
I think Yeah. I take your question. I have friends from Special Forces, relatives from Special Forces, who felt the abandonment of their people that they knew and have worked closely with for a number of years and a number of tours personally. And I do think that there is an argument to be made that perhaps that encouraged Putin to think that he could get away with it in Ukraine. So yeah, it's, in terms of Asia, it's a little bit different in the sense that there is long-standing close cooperation, habits of cooperation, sort of muscle memory of working together closely in good times and in bad. I think that helps to some degree, and the more we stay involved, and frankly, some of the things that one of the candidates has said about alliances, caused issue in Asia, but I do believe that the Asians understand, particularly our allies, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Filipinos, understand that that U.S. alliance is the only thing protecting them from an East Asia that is totally dominated by China. So I assume that it caused some angst in Asia, but the immediate reinforcement of the alliances, the increasingly close work with the alliances, I think has helped. For the other countries in the area, let's face it, it's a great debating point for the Chinese. Now, they try to use it in Taiwan even. Well, look at the U.S., they're unreliable. There's something called Lu, the Doubt America theory. And it's undeniable. Something like that does cost you. You got to keep your word, you got to keep your promises, you got to keep your commitments. Japan, South Korea, and the Filipinos have looked upon us as, by and large, keeping our commitments to them. But it's in the back of people's minds, probably.
This is an interesting question. I think maybe General Bramlett, and I'm seeing we might be almost out of time. I don't know, we started a little late. I toss it over to you. Can we go a little bit longer? 2:45. 2:45, oh, thank you very much, okay. We started late. What is the future of Title IX in the Japanese Constitution as they face China's buildup? I think that's toward remilitarizing. And then what would the leaders of the United States in the 1950s advise us today on the growing military forces in Japan? Do you want to take that, sir? Play like you're in the Japanese parliament.
Title IX is rearmament. I think the success in NATO, I'm going to go out on a limb because I'm not current. I haven't traveled in the AO, the area of operation, enough to get a first-person report. But I suspect the self-defense forces is their current category. They are our Army, Navy, Air Force by any definition, but constitutionally they're a self-defense force. I think anything they can do to help, as we did in Europe with NATO, I think would be well received. Now there's going to be angst in China and Korea, but I think that the U.S. can work through that. That's an assessment based on a historical perspective, not current.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on Constitution?
Yeah, Japan is shifting very quickly. I mean, when you see them, in effect, promising to double their defense budget within, I guess it was 4 years, 5 years. The title doesn't mean much, but there are some practical considerations in terms of what they could actually do in terms of any sort of crisis breaking out. In effect, you would almost have to have an attack on Japan itself and Japanese casualties before, under their constitution, they could feel justified to use force in support of other countries, particularly the U.S. You look at it, though, and you say that's probably going to change. They're changing definitions fairly quickly. there's a big shift in terms of the Japanese collective fear of China. There is a growing recognition that geography counts, and that if China takes over Taiwan by force, that immediately threatens Japan's Southwest Islands, and not just the Senkakus, but all of the islands that are not even debated internationally.
I would say, they just add one thing about the leaders of the 1950s and how they might look at it. Well, you know, they were making difficult choices in relation to Japan at that time. You know, ending the occupation, turning over sovereignty to Japan, actually also having to make the determination to release some of the war criminals who had been prosecuted and incarcerated. And I've seen personally the documents, pardon documents that Dwight Eisenhower signed as a new president in 1953. So, you know, these are tough choices that they were recognizing then that were built toward a greater good. They all envisioned, of course, in that time, a Japanese self-defense force that would never expand beyond that. But I think they would have had, certainly Eisenhower, I think, had the kind of flexibility of mind to understand that things change. And of course, they would have understood in their time as very well as we do 70 some odd years later, the threats posed by the People's Republic of China. All of that happening in the context of the Korean War in the early 1950s and everything that flows from that. So I don't know that they would register any kind of tremendous alarm or opposition to it. And of course, let's remember too that we had busily rearmed the Germans too, just you know, almost at that same time. And who could have envisioned this? You know, when you think about the broader expanse of history, that's lightning quick. Just a few years after the end of World War II, we're putting, you know, weapons back into the hands of Germans, and to some extent Japanese too, once they get the sovereignty and have this self-defense force.
I have two questions, and they're kind of similar. John, I'm going to ask you to maybe take the lead on this. And we've touched on some of these a bit, I think, but if you could go back in time and serve as an advisor to the U.S. President, and I know, of course, Ambassador, you have been an advisor. I'm going to ask John historically, if he could go back in time and serve as an advisor to the U.S. President, what would you encourage him to try in order to avoid escalation to war? The next one is, in the lead up to World War II, what are the most important parallels to what we see today? So what would you advise back then, and you would?
Well, I would just say, if I were advising President Roosevelt back then, he probably wouldn't like me very much. He'd be like, oh, that historian, that know-it-all historian, always constantly saying, hey, look at what happened in the past, you need to do this. But I really would say that war with Japan is not inevitable, that there are a lot of different ways to handle this, that maybe through better communication, in retrospect, that could have been a way to diffuse the conflict. And I don't think there was much we could do about the kind of fanaticism that was present in some echelons of the Japanese armed forces and elsewhere in society. That was going to have to be dealt with. What I think was the challenge of our policy back then, and Ambassador Crew was just constantly trying to work through this, is how we aid and abet and empower the more moderating forces in Japanese life. And this is a great challenge for Roosevelt, as he's juggling many other balls too in this country. And so he's listening to competing perspectives in the State Department and the War Department too. And I would just tell him, if I'm sort of at his elbow as an historian, I would say, I think maybe the state takes the lead on this. That you have someone with Drew's sagacity and his relationships and his level of understanding, that maybe this is a time for you to get directly and personally involved with whoever we perceive is the decision maker on the Japanese side here. Prince Koinoe, of course, will famously offer to meet with Roosevelt and all that. Of course, by the time he does that, a lot of water was under the proverbial bridge. But still, I think dialogue could have been something of the key to at least create some chance to avoid war.
Thank you. Anybody want to stand up and use a microphone from the audience? No? Okay. And then we've been talking about hard power, smart power. A question that kind of touches on soft power. And this was to General Bramlett. As a Rotarian, how important are organizations like this to assist the journey to peace?
Any organization like Rotary that reaches out across the globe will be very helpful, because what you represent, Rotarians and others that non-governmental organizations that reach out across national boundaries with their values intact. And again, there's difficulty in some parts of the world, but anything that can export values, democratic values particularly. Rotarians do good work in healthcare. That can't be banned. And it's an easy question to say. Probably the experience for the people you touch as Rotarians and other NGOs will last. And things you bring to the table, you bring to the experience, would only do good. I'm repeating myself, but if you go out to do good, you do good.
Thank you for that. As a former Peace Corps volunteer and 30 years with the East-West Center working in public diplomacy, yes, whoever asked that question, very good. There's, again, we've covered some of this, but John, you've mentioned Japan's feelings of existential crisis due to access to resources. And this question is there a similar feeling in China today? And are there concessions that can be made? I want to look at this. We've talked about, right now, it's all about a China threat or China's aggression. What is at the root of that, and what is a little bit of the history and the lead up to this? Because China's been there for many years, we've been here. What's leading this right now? Well, yeah, it would probably be the best. And then others can weigh in from their perspectives, of course.
I would say that, similar to Japan, their sense of insecurity developed in China after and it goes way back to just as I was starting to engage with China, 88, 89, the Tinian massacre. That was a direct threat to the leadership of the Communist Party of China. That was followed very quickly by the collapse of the Soviet Union and by the spread of democracy in Central and East Europe, color revolutions in Central Asia. And then the cherry on top of this paranoia sundae was the Iraq War, where the United States and other allies and partners rolled over the Iraqi military. It was such an easy defeat of Iraq that China, I think, perceived that A, the U.S. was encouraging democracy around the world, they were going to try and do it here, and B, they had, the United States and its allies had overwhelming military power. And that's when China started increasing its military budget and developing its military budget. Then in the early 1990s, China joins the WTO, becomes a respected trader around the world, and the economy starts taking off. And what you see is a China that's very quickly developing its economy, its power. On the other hand, still has that paranoia that the outside world is out to get it. So yeah, there are clear parallels there. In terms of what can you give China to calm them down, give them Taiwan. I think that would be absolutely disastrous for U.S. interests. Unfortunately, I'm not being flippant. Xi Jinping, as I said earlier, says that his mission isn't over until Taiwan is unified with mainland China. Just as importantly, he says most of what we call the South China Sea is his to play with. Perhaps more importantly, something we don't pay attention to, because they don't spread this message broadly internationally, but internally, they talk a lot about how the global system needs to change. And the global system needs to change from one that the democracies hammered out after World War II to one where authoritarian governments feel comfortable and where China basically gets the final say on any issue that affects Chinese interests.
If I could add just one very quick thing about the broader sweep of history too. that's so fundamentally tragic and consequential about all of this that we're talking about is that, you know, Sino-American relations way back when were really pretty good. And China was thought to be, by the early 20th century, American policymakers as our main partner in Asia. We go to war with Japan over China on many levels in World War II. And the incredible tragedy of that, of course, is that China becomes our bitter, implacable enemy in the immediate aftermath of World War II, leading subsequently to two wars that simply don't happen if the People's Republic of China doesn't occur. Korea and Vietnam, and then whatever else will follow. So, I mean, these are really massive issues that you could argue are more important to us in terms of our geostrategic interests, our security, our domestic situation, whatever we happen to be talking about. You could argue more than anything in recent or past American history.
Thank you. We only have a few more minutes left, but I have 3 questions on Russia and Ukraine. I'm going to read them quickly, and since the major focus of this has been the Pacific region, but I have 3 questions so it's on people's minds. So, one, what do you think the best steps to take are with relation to the Russian-Ukrainian war? And given the current situation between Russia and Ukraine, what can be done to resolve this and bring an end to this conflict? And is economic resources, are economic resources the basis of conflict between countries, for example, Russia's war in Ukraine? It throws in Israel and Gaza, but we won't go there. That's a whole other topic. But there are 3 just quick thoughts on Russia and Ukraine, and if not, that's okay. We'll save that for going next time.
I mean, I don't pretend great expertise on that war, except to understand, something of the historical roots of it. This is a nationalist conflict that goes back, 100 some odd years or beyond. This is just, in my view, just the latest phase in many other phases of Russian-Ukrainian conflict that in the modern period date back to World War I, when the Ukrainians wanted their own country and didn't get it, whereas their next door neighbors, the Poles, did. And we forget this too, by the way. After World War II, you have a Ukrainian independence movement that fought the Red Army, and this fighting went on into the 1950s. So, I mean, in that sense, we're sort of tangential players to that, but we understand that the war has larger implications for our security interests in Europe and just world security as a whole. What I think could be sad is that it may not be to our interest to end the conflict, in the sense that we could continue to degrade Russia by, supporting Ukraine, and not that we shouldn't, but I'm saying that is one way you could look at it. How the conflict could end, boy, I wish I could tell you, but smarter people than I are, working on that right now. I have no idea. If it's like many conflicts, it'll drag on for longer than anyone ever expected, and I think that's already happened.
Thank you. Ambassador, do you have any thoughts on Russia-Ukraine?
I don't have any better thoughts than to say that we've got to support Ukraine. And I do take it because, I'm part Polish, and, we have the Baltic members of NATO and the EU, and you just go, wow. If we let Russia take Ukraine, how can we possibly pretend that Poland and the Baltic states are safe? And at that point, we do get, our NATO obligations kick in, but basically our moral obligations to say, how can we possibly let a revanchist power that alienated these peoples for centuries move back in? Quick anecdote to end this with. In Beijing, I would meet very regularly with the Polish deputy chief of mission, who had served as the interpreter for Polish leaders talking to Mao Zedong in the 1950s. He got increasingly senior positions at the embassy until Solidarity struck in Poland, and they didn't trust him anymore. The government didn't, so they brought him back to Poland. A decade later, Poland turns into a democracy. He ends up in Beijing, knowing everybody. Good friend, good contact. He would explain things to me. I'd say, what the heck is going on here? He'd know what the heck was going on there. And then one day, we have our usual talk, at the end of which he says, Jim, would you drink a toast with me? I'd like to drink a shot of vodka with you, Jim. I said, Okay, I've never done it before, Friday afternoon, I'm not gonna go back to the embassy and write it up or anything. So I said, sure, I'll drink a toast with you. So we drink the toast, okay? Later on, he's walking me out of the embassy. And he says, Jim, I don't think you really understood why we drank that toast. I said, well, you know, we're friends and it's the first time. And he says, no, Jim, you don't understand. Today is the day that Poland joined NATO. And for the first time in 1,000 years, we Poles feel safe. And that story sticks with me. So that's all I want to say about Russia and Ukraine.
Thank you. Very good, General.
I agree with the ambassador that continue to support Ukraine for the reasons that the ambassador touched on. Let me close my comments with this parallel with the 30s and today. And I didn't comment then, but I will comment now. The difference is, from the military standpoint, the 30s, and John touched on this, the lack of preparedness, military preparedness prior to World War II. We have the American military, all the crises and all the friction points we talked about, they drill so hard to be ready. And they are skilled, experienced, the Air Force, the Navy, the Marines, the Army. It's the best military we field. Is it enough? They would tell you they need more soldiers, airplanes, ships. Because the military is the keepers of the flame. They are conservative little c in the defense of this country. They will want more, but they are ready. There's the parallels between the 30s and the 20s, if you will, now the 20s, is frightening in one sense. But the difference is the military is ready to go, and I should say that. They will want more because of who they are. They can't afford not to win.
Thank you, and thank you to the audience members who wrote the questions. We're going to keep these because we learned from your questions and how do we go forward. And you folks have been amazing, really. I've learned so much just listening to each of you, so thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to turn this back over to Sonny or John or one of our leaders here. John, and I hope you do recognize some of your team here.
Yes, well, let me just thank the panel and Karen again. One more round of applause for our panel. And we have a token of our appreciation to each of the panel members and to Karen. The Hawaiian fish hook is a symbol of humanity's connection to humanity as well as to the ocean. So very appropriate for this discussion. I'll say the journey's begun, and there are more panels, discussions to happen over the next 18 or so months as we journey toward the 80th anniversary of the end of the war. So stay tuned for future announcements on where and when for all that. But I do want to acknowledge and thank the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, which has been fantastic and very welcoming for us to start this here. Also want to acknowledge the West Point Society of Hawaii for enabling and resourcing some of this, as well as the Pearl Harbor Rotary Club and East West Center, obviously, and an array of other interests and stakeholders that are we're building the team around. So once again, thanks. I think we have the panelists will probably mill around a little bit if there's some follow-on questions. We do have book signing right outside the door, John's books. If you want to acquire and get John's signature on those, it'd be great. I think we could go right out this door here to get to the book signing. Oh, the back door, I'm sorry. Okay, and I just want to hand off to Dennis Drake for any closing comments. Dennis?
Thank you all. I want to just take a couple minutes and talk about the person responsible for this event. He's from New York City. His name is Gil Messler. He graduated from West Point in 1975, and for the last 50 years has had an illustrious career as a Special Forces Green Beret. He worked in Europe during the Cold War, in Korea, and after 9/11 in Afghanistan and Iraq. On 9/11, I could tell you a war story about him because he was in New York, but I won't, in the interest of time, do that. But about a year ago, Gil had an epiphany. Gil now works for U.S. Army Pacific here in Fort Shafter. About a year ago, he had an epiphany. He said, you know, my whole life I've been training for war. And there's just got to be a better way. Because we know that people who know each other, culturally, different countries, and they get to know each other, they don't tend to fight each other. And so Gil came up with this Journey of Peace idea, and the idea of building a cohort of young leaders in the future from different countries that can come to events like this and get to know each other. So I just want to give him a round of applause, Mr. Gil Messler. At the risk of giving him the mic, you have anything to say?
Oh, well, I didn't actually expect to get a mic in my hand. I just wanted to shake hands with the panel. My goodness, thank you, our participants here. Thank this panel, Karen, Melody, Crystal, Dennis, Sonny, Jared, John, and others. Wow, this is just the beginning. We want to continue this through key events during the coming year, culminating initially with the summer of 2025 when we hit the 80th anniversary of the horrific atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the continuing firebombing of Japanese cities, and the surrender of the Imperial Japanese to the Allied forces on the 15th of August, 1945, which 80 years will be 2025. But we want to continue this. We want to build on bringing young people together. Here we have mostly not very old people, but we want to get cohorts of high schoolers, college students, young professionals, grad students, and others, you know, who are young at heart, together to build relationships. Because just as we've said, Karen and panel, when you know each other, democracies don't fight each other. Well, people who know each other well don't fight each other. And so for the future, you know, for the two boys sitting in the back, Roman, Jared's son, my son Gordon, your sons and daughters, this is why we do this. Thank you all very much. God bless you. Thank you all very much.
All right, this concludes our program. Please scan the QR code to join our mailing list for our next event on October 26th.